So let's say a little bit more about this time of transition that we're in. Well, the pandemic, I believe, has exposed weaknesses in our economies and in our leadership worldwide. It's not that these things weren't there. It's just that as life was proceeding normally, we could brush past it, we could ignore it. But the pandemic has thrown a number of these flaws and limitations into stark contrast. So the cracks were there, but they weren't destabilizing as they are now. The instability created by the pandemic have exposed those weaknesses. For example, the situation in the United States in terms of its medical system, where unless you've got private medical insurance, you're really up the creek without a paddle. Things like in the US again, support for the unemployed, which is not like the way it is here in Australia. The Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, we'd already seen before the pandemic, situations of police brutality and riots as a result of it, but not to the scale that we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement as a result of the pandemic, because that instability has created more anxiety among people, more a sense of urgency. So it means that these flaws that were already there have suddenly become much more major. And this all is certainly unsettling for the rest of the world, because for so long, certainly the US, since the Second World War, has been looked at as the policeman for the world, and particularly for democracy. So when we see that country imploding on itself, it has a destabilizing effect on the world and on us. Because also what we've seen is China taking advantage of the current situation to further its agenda in terms of its control of its seaways. And this also has impacted personally on Australian society as we've tried to maintain our connections with the US. So there are movements afoot that tell us that things probably won't go back to normal after the pandemic is brought under control, if, like I said, it even can be brought under control. So how do we respond to these challenges at a time when people need support and are looking for a sense of stability? But the pandemic has also, I would suggest, exposed other important factors for us that we can learn from. It has exposed a way of life that has been bound to one that we took for granted. And now it has forced us to actively examine what is really important to us. Simple example, before the pandemic came, I would probably go to a restaurant 2 or 3 times a week. I haven't been to a restaurant since the pandemic started. That concern to sort of eat at home, make sure that the food that I've got is cleaned, it's all safe. All those things have impacted a lot of people. That, of course, has an impact on restaurant owners who are already feeling the effects of lockdowns. So all of those things impact us. So one of the things that we've learned from this is we have been bound to a way of life. We took that way of life for granted. Now, that way of life has been taken away from us. Although a lot of people, I think, would still be living on a holding pattern, hoping that it'll come back. But as we've already looked at, it might not come back. So that's why I think it's important to ask, what do we learn from this? What have we learned from lockdown, from having to live differently to the way we lived before? So maybe we can start by looking at what are we bound to. You see, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus frees a man who has been possessed by an unclean spirit. The man in that gospel story has been held captive by a force over which he has little or no control, that robs him of his freedom, alienates him from God and others, and stunts his human growth. We too can be held captive by forces over which we have little control, forces that can rob us of freedom, alienate us from God and others, and stunt our human growth. An example of this is our addiction to possessions. In a recent book written on the problem called Affluenza, and you can see that that is a play on two words, affluence and influenza. This basically is defined in the book as the unfulfilled feeling that results from efforts to keep up with the Joneses. So in a lot of words, it's an illusion that people could be quite happy with living a simpler life, as we've been forced to do in the pandemic. But the thing is that the Joneses have just put a pool into their backyard, so unless we put a pool in, we're not going to look like we're at the same economic status as them. So it creates this need for possessions, which actually is an illusion, because we can actually live a much simpler life, as the lockdown has actually shown us. So we can become confused about what it takes to live a worthwhile life. And part of this confusion is a failure to distinguish between what we want and what we need. Just have a chat to each other about that, and maybe how your own experience of lockdown has impacted on that.